So I'm going to be reading 103 amazing facts about the Black Indian of the Western Hemisphere outline. My people are destroyed for the lack of knowledge, because thou hast rejected knowledge. I will also reject thee, that thou shalt be no priest to me, seeing that thou hast forgotten the law of thy God. I will also forget thy children. Hosea 4:6. Page 1. Black Indians have lived in the Western Hemisphere since time immemorial. Number 2. Black Indians were not spawned or created as a result of Africans coming into the Western Hemisphere during the transatlantic slave trade, mixing in with native people of the Western Hemisphere region, also known as Native American Indians. And to me, that makes a lot of sense logically, because if the whole world was inhabited with people of color, just like they teach us in Western academia that we're so-called African Americans, which some of us probably do have African lineage, but we also have European lineage. We are from every continent of this earth, us being the original, the indigenous man, right? Number 3, Native or indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere, also known as Indians, did not refer to themselves or their ancestors as Indians. We use the word Indian since most people are accustomed to this title. The word Indian, red man or ruddy, and Native American are European colonized terms. Native or indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere refer to themselves by way of tones, vibrations of expression. Your spirit said who and what you are, as the Most High did, as the children of Yashar'el. The name given to you was based upon what type of spirit you possessed. Okay. Number 4, all native or indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere, aka Indians, possess different physiological features. Hair texture, bone structure, and skin tone varied. Number 5, all native or indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere, aka Indians, did not and do not have high cheekbones, slanted eyes, reddish copper skin, or straight black hair. Number 6, all native or indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere did not live in teepees and pueblos. Number 7, it is difficult for society to accept Black Indians as being native or indigenous to the Western Hemisphere region, because society, especially in Western academia, has brainwashed with fabricated fake images of indigenous people in the Western Hemisphere, aka Indians. Number 8, most reservation Indians were carefully selected by the U.S. government to occupy reservations when reservations were being established. Number 9, the U.S. government for the most part selected pale-skinned Indians or Hollywood version Indians to occupy U.S. government-established reservations. Number 10, the U.S. government selected a certain physiological type of native, aka Indian, to promote to the world as this is a real Indian, as well as this is how a real Indian looks. Number 11, the dark-skinned natives indigenous to the Western Hemisphere, aka Indians, were reclassified during the 17 and 1800s as Negroes and Coloreds. 12, certain dark-skinned natives were allowed to settle on reservations, with pale-skinned natives, most were not. 13, pale-skinned natives came about as a result of the original dark-skinned natives breeding with pale-skinned Europeans. A light-skinned native born from this union would again breed with a pale-skinned European. Thus, the progeny of this union would become more pale or genetically recessive. After centuries of this breeding process, eventually produced the pale-skinned native of the Western Hemisphere. The dark-skinned natives who did not mix their seeds still endure. The U.S. government has reclassified most as Black Americans or African Americans. 14, certain dark-skinned natives indigenous to the Western Hemisphere, aka Indians, were given an ultimatum: go to Oklahoma and be an Indian on a reservation, or stay where you're at and be reclassified as a Negro or colored. 15, Most dark-skinned natives indigenous to the Western Hemisphere, aka Indians, who were reclassified as Negro or colored during the 17th and 1800s, have found themselves in the 20th and 21st century, again reclassified as Black Americans and African Americans. 16. Dark-skinned natives indigenous to the Western Hemisphere, aka Indians, who embraced the Spanish culture during the colonial era, either by choice or by force, have found themselves engulfed or assimilated into Spanish culture and the Spanish language. Now, most of them have lost the knowledge of themselves and their true identity. They have been reclassified as Latino or Hispanic. 17. All native people or indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere spoke different dialects of a language synonymous to the Hebrew language. I repeat, all native people or indigenous people of color, I might add, of the Western Hemisphere spoke different dialects of a language synonymous to the Hebrew language. Let that sink in.
Interesting enough, look at the angle of the Great Pyramid of Giza. If you take the angle of the Great Pyramid of Giza, the slope is 51.8 degrees. Let's go back to the earthworks. If you measure the line that goes straight through the center of the structure, right here, and then you'll go true north, it's 51.8 degrees. That angle is exactly the same angle as the pyramids of Giza. It is the same math, the same calculations as ancient Egyptians. Let me show you one more connection. In 1860, David Wyrick, he's a guy who surveyed the Newark earthworks. He was digging into a mound near those earthworks, and he found a wooden coffin made of oak. They opened up the coffin and found a skeleton of a man holding a little box. It was about 8.10 inches in size. The box had been cemented shut here. This, by the way, is sitting in Ohio. Well, he opened up the box and he found a little man inside, a little black stone. They took it to scholars and they looked at it. The man seems to be carrying something, and there's writing here at first they couldn't recognize. The writing is, they thought in 1860, some sort of Hebrew. Well, finally, about 20 years later, they found some rabbis living in the area, and the rabbis looked at that and they could read it. They said it was an old kind of block Hebrew, and it was a rendition of the Ten Commandments. Now, this is another piece. Block Hebrew, they said they'd never seen anything like it. Mainstream archaeologists at the time called this a hoax. But then in 1900, or just about after 1900, in Israel, they found the same block-style Hebrew writing. Mainstream archaeologists still dismiss the findings. They found it in Israel and they found it in Ohio. But there was another stone that they found that they couldn't argue. This is the Bat Creek stone. It was found during the course of an official Smithsonian evacuation. The Smithsonian didn't understand the meaning of the writing on the stone. They thought it was Cherokee since it came from Cherokee country. They didn't realize that it's actually Hebrew. They had published this originally upside down. They threw it in a box at the bottom of the Smithsonian, put it in the basement. Many years later, a scholar took it out of the box, looked at it, and went, oh my gosh, it's upside down. It's Phoenician, ancient Hebrew. So what's going on here? What is that about? Where is that history? I'll show you in a few minutes, and we're going to have a conversation. And I'm going to show you some more things that the Smithsonian, science, government, commerce colluded to erase. By the way, I want to thank the directors of the documentary Lost Civilizations of North America for bringing these stories to my attention. I was blown away. To find more, visit the website lostcivilizationdvd.com. Here's the thing we should be asking ourselves. I don't know the story of these. Do you know that? Did you know that? Do you live in Ohio and did you know that? Why not? Were the American Indians wronged? Yes. Yes. And that's what we focus on in America, is we were bad to the American. Forget about it. It's in the past. The question should be the ones that the founders asked. Who are they? What knowledge do they have? Can you imagine the difference we would have now if we would put our differences aside and put our past in the past and concentrate on today and say, let's learn from each other? What do you have? What is that? What is that? When we come back, I'm going to be joined by Peter Lilback, who is, I've told you before, is one of my favorite authors. He's going to talk to me a little bit about the founders here. And I'm also going to show you some documents that show how that history has been erased.
Number 18. Most early European writers during the 1400s throughout the 1800s, including pale-skinned Jews, all agreed that the heathen savage of the Western Hemisphere, aka Indians, throughout the Americas were, without a doubt, descendants of the lost tribes of Israel. I repeat, descendants of the lost tribes of Israel. Number 19. A pale-skinned European by the name of James Adair, an English writer and trader during the 18th century, lived amongst black Indians in the southeast. James Adair wrote a book entitled History of the American Indian. In his book, he claimed that the Indians of the Western Hemisphere were descendants of the lost tribes of Israel. Number 20. James Adair, in his book History of the American Indian, wrote 23 arguments to support his findings that the so-called American Indians were descendants of the lost tribes of Israel. Now I'm going to go to the book The Nazis by Time magazine to show the generic heritage of the Jews or Israelites, as well as J.A. Rogers, what he says about the indigenous Negroes living in America before Columbus. So right here we have the Nazi Time magazine book, Hitler. Turn to page 132. And as I showed in older videos, this is Hitler sitting down. Goebbels and Hitler personally appraised a new German movie when Führer, if I'm pronouncing it right, complained that films espousing the Nazi line were too scarce. Goebbels rushed a pair of anti-Semitic pictures into production. In one segment of a Nazi instructional film, right, the genetic heritage of the Jew or Israelite, thus there's tribes, not just one people, is reportedly traced to Oriental, keyword Negro, near Asian and Hamitic peoples. Okay, so the Israelites were a mixed race, Hamitic and Shemitic. You can find this in the scriptures. All right, right here, Oriental. You got the Niger, Hamite, Hamitan, and then you have this guy right here. Okay. Now this book, 100 Amazing Facts About the Negro with Complete Proof, J.A. Rogers. Ancient Civilizations. 16. Negroes lived in the Americas thousands of years before Columbus. Central American monuments show numerous carvings of them as gods. When Columbus came to the New World, Negroes had been crossing from Africa to South America at a distance of 1,600 miles. The first white man to reach the American mainland, tell of seeing Negroes. Columbus, who visited South America, said they had heard of them there. So it was already here. Let's go to the back, the proof. 16. On the presence of the Negro in America before Columbus, C.C. Marquez says the Negro type is seen in the most ancient American sculpture. The Negro figure frequently in the most remote traditions of some American pueblos. It is to this race doubtlessly belongs to the most ancient skeletons of a very distant structure of two of the red American races, which have been found in various places from Bolivia to Mexico. Okay. Columbus says he wanted to find out what the Indians had told him, that there had come to it from South and Southeast Negro peoples. Journal of the Voyage, page 6. Okay. Read this right here. V. Rera Bellico says, it is indisputable that in very ancient times, the Negro race occupied our territory, Mexico, when the two continents were joined, Pangaea, before the flood. This race brought its own religious cults and ideas. Mexico, A. Travis de los Singlos, Volume 1, page 63 to 67, Mexico, 1887. The Mexicans recalled a Negro god, I can't pronounce that word, Itilicon, which means blackface, page 163. So, I mean, all this information from different books is adding up. The continents were all connected at one point. This skin phenotype is all over the earth. We have to realize that. It's not just from one continent. Africa is a modern term. Times have been changed. Names. We have to really sink that in when we're reading this history. Things were not what they were in the days of antiquity. But it's even like with direction. How do we know this is north? How do we know this is south? I mean, for crying out loud, they changed the maps and turned them upside down, for crying out loud. So we really got to think about everything that we've learned. And then when we came into the truth, because it's only a certain level of truth that most of us reach. And then it goes further and further on. It's a rabbit hole, right? So right here we have the book, We Are the Washington, the indigenous black inhabitants of North America, the untold story of the ancient ones, the original black mound building inhabitants of North America. Page 36. What is the origin of the Washington? I'm not going to read all of it, but I'm going to read certain parts that are highlighted. In the return of the ancient ones, the Empress points to the book of Genesis 10 and 25 in the day of Peleg, when the waters divided the earth Mu. So this is after the flood. So now I'm going to go to Genesis chapter 10 and verse 25. Start at 22. The children of Shem. So Shem was over here in the Americas as well. The children of Shem, Elam and Esher and Arphaxad and Lud and Aram. And the children of Aram, Uz, Hul and Gether and Mash. And Arphaxad begot Salah, and Salah begot Eber. And to Eber were born two sons. The name of one was Peleg, for in his days was the earth divided. And his brother's name was Joktan. Okay. So as we can see in this book, the earth, or the land continents, were all connected. Eons ago, the Americas were joined to the continent of Africa. Okay. That's why I say we're everywhere, not just in so-called Africa. All right. All of the descendants of Africa now living in North America did not arrive on slave ships, nor during the voyages of the Egyptians, the Moors, the Phoenicians, the Hebrews, or the Mandingos, all having the same origin. Let me highlight that. Let me repeat this. All having the same origin, Genesis 10 and 25. Well, actually, we can go to Genesis 9 and 26. 9 and 26. All right. Genesis 9 and 26. And he said, blessed be the Lord God of Shem, and Canaan shall be his servant. But more emphasis on the Lord God of Shem. Okay. So all having the same origin, which are Shemites, but of different eras. A study of true history will show that all the continents were once connected, Pangaea, and that the southeastern sections of the United States was actually a part of Northwest Africa and South America. Ouachita Moors are indigenous to this land. We are the first world. We have always been here and shall always be here. That's why we're taught his story. Okay? Everyone's story is not the same, but they teach you that in these indoctrination schools. 21. Nat Turner, Paul Cuff, Crispus Attucks, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Harriet Tubman, Denmark Vesey, Elijah Poole, aka the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, amongst millions of others, were indigenous to the Western Hemisphere, aka Indians. 22. The titles Black American, African American are fake, inappropriate European colonized titles to keep indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere, aka Indians, under a spell of ignorance. 23. The titles Black American and African American were purposely created to psychologically and spiritually disconnect indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere, aka Indians, from their true motherland, which is right up under their feet. 24. The Reverend Jesse Jackson, a South Carolina Cherokee, started and promoted the fake title of African American that has been imposed upon Black Indians indigenous to the Western Hemisphere region. 25. It has become quite profitable to brainwash the indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere, aka Indians, into thinking that Africa is their native land. 26. There is a campaign currently underway by the U.S. government and U.S. government-sponsored natives that preaches a doctrine that says that the Black Indian of the Western Hemisphere is a result of African mixture and has not always dwelled in the Western Hemisphere. 27. Most so-called Black Americans or so-called African Americans, when asked if any Native Americans in their family, at least 95% will respond with the answer yes. In addition to this, the most so-called Black Americans or so-called African Americans are also able to give you the name of the tribe that their relative comes from. Thus, the so-called Black American or African American oddly insists upon calling themselves Black American or African Americans instead of referring to themselves by the way of the ancestral tribe name that has survived in their family, which in essence is their true nationality. 28. Most so-called Black Americans or so-called African Americans find it difficult to accept themselves as being native or indigenous to the Western Hemisphere because of programmed, fabricated images of native people in the Western Hemisphere. Fake images of their own indigenous ancestors has been routinely drilled into their psyche since birth. The Black Indian image does not register within their psyche because of the fake imagery programming that the U.S. government has instilled into their minds, of how native or indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere look. The spirit of the so-called Black Americans or so-called African Americans tells them one thing, while the programmed fake images of their own ancestors says another. This all leads to inner conflict. 29. The U.S. school system and the media have been the two biggest giants behind programming into the masses fake fabricated images of natives or indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere, aka Indians. Number 30. Native or indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere, aka Indians, build pyramids and pyramid mounds just like the ancient Egyptians. This synonymous comparison of both cultures from opposite sides of the world is because they both were genetically linked. They both are the same people. 31. During the time of Pangaea, a Greek word that means all one All of the continents on the planet Earth were one mass of land. People lived and thrived during the time of Pangaea. This is a large explanation as to why pyramid builders in the Eastern Hemisphere and pyramid builders in the Western Hemisphere have cultures that are incredibly synonymous. The continents continue to move. Some move 4 inches a year. The continents will one day become one mass of land again. The continents are currently separated at this time. However, the genetic link of beings from Pangaea never parted.